Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast dedicated to the impact of a shock on nominal wages using a consumption function without distribution effects. The debate on wages is well known. On one hand, an increase in nominal wages means that the cost of production for firms will increase. On the other hand, wages are a core component of consumption and demand. So within our model, do we understand a shock on wages as a supply shock or as a demand shock? Up to now, we assumed that the entirety of the income generated through production was distributed to households, either in the form of wages or in the form of dividends. We were dealing with an aggregate consumption function based on the income overall, which was not taking into account different behaviors according to the different sources of revenue. For instance, between wages and dividends. In lesson 2, if you remember, we briefly mentioned that it would be possible to use a consumption function that would incorporate these differences. We call that a consumption function with distribution effects. We will come back to this in the next podcast. For now, we will still consider an aggregate consumption function. In this case, an increase in nominal wages does not impact consumption, as we do not have W in the consumption function. An increase in nominal wages is only then a negative supply shock. Indeed, all other things remaining equal, an increase in W leads to an increase in real wages. So the real cost of labor increases and profits decrease. Firms will demand less labor and supply less goods to maximize their profit. Let's now look at what happens in the short term. Before the shock, our economy was at its initial long-term equilibrium in imperfect competition with monopolistic competition and a fixed negotiated real wage. Then, the economy faces an exogenous shock on nominal wages, DW higher than zero. Remember that in the short term, prices and wages are fixed, and the production is constrained by the effective demand. So, because P is fixed, an increase in W triggers an increase in the real wage. For this new higher level of real wage, the labor demand decreases. Which makes sense. Labor costs more, so firms will hire less people. To this level of labor demand corresponds a supply of goods, YS short term, obtained through the production function. This YS short term is lower than Y0. This shock has no impact on the demand of goods because, as we said, the consumption function does not have any distribution effects here. So the demand stays at the initial level of production, YD short term equals Y0. Supply is less than demand. We have a disequilibrium on the goods market. In the short term, in imperfect competition, we assume that firms can adjust to this higher level of demand by increasing production, even though they will no longer maximize their profits. Overall, the output Y short term does not vary from its initial level Y0. Graphically, nothing happens in the plane YR, as IS and LM are not impacted. The interest rate does not vary either. However, this short-term equilibrium is still hiding an excess demand of goods. The level of unemployment remains constant, as production did not vary. This level is higher than the actual demand of the firms. And we see that this new equilibrium on the labor market is outside of the firm's labor demand curve. So the firms do not maximize their profits. In the medium term, prices become flexible while the nominal wage remains fixed at its new value, W1. In the short term, we ended up with an excess demand of goods, which means that prices will increase, which will push the supply up and push the demand down through the indirect channel of the interest rate. Graphically, the increase in P shifts LM to the left, and Y medium term is lower than Y short term, while the interest rate is now higher. So the output decreases compared to the short term and compared to the initial equilibrium. Employment will therefore decrease compared to the short term. We see here again the apparent paradox of the medium term. Employment decreased, even though the real wage went down due to the increase in prices. In the long term, W, P, and R are flexible, while real rigidities remain in imperfect competition. What happens in the long term depends on whether the initial increase in W will have an effect on the long-term negotiated real wage. In practice, an increase in W will trigger an increase in gamma. If the real wage comes back to the initial gamma, this would mean that workers only negotiated a nominal raise, which is not very useful in the long term. And so that it would mean that they would be subject to monetary illusion. It's a possibility, but it's not the assumption that we're going to make for this class. So we will assume that an increase in W will trigger an increase in gamma to gamma prime, the new level of negotiated real wage. In the medium term, prices increased, which decreased the real wage to a level below its new negotiated long-term level. In the long term, when nominal wages become flexible, W increases, which will lead to an upward wage price spiral until the real wage reaches its new negotiated level, gamma prime. At this level, we do not come back to the initial level of employment in the economy, which is what we would have said in the case of a demand shock. Here, the cost of labor increased permanently. So the firms employ less people, and we end up with a lower level of employment than at the initial equilibrium. In the long term, as you know, the model is dichotomous, meaning that employment and production are determined by the firm's maximization program. The firms produce less and hire less in the long term because their profitability was negatively impacted by the permanent increase in the real wage. The economy reaches in the long term the level of desired production that was determined in the short term. The level of output Y long term is therefore completely determined by the supply side and which is equal to YS short term. The increase in prices in the long term shifts LM once again to the left, and interest rates rise again, which decreases Y between the medium term and the long term. Note once again that we are in imperfect competition, so there still is some persisting unemployment in the economy, even more than at the initial situation. Overall, we can conclude that an increase in nominal wages generates unemployment in the long term. Let's finally represent the shock in the plane YP. Due to the shock, the supply of goods decreases for any given price. The quasi-supply curve pivots to the left, as W is not expressed in the axis. In the short term, the increase in W has no impact on the demand because prices are fixed, and the short-term equilibrium is the same as the initial situation. This short-term equilibrium is, however, hiding an excess demand of goods. Note that the firms are located outside of their supply curve, so they do not maximize their profit. The excess demand results in higher prices in the medium term, which will increase the supply and decrease the demand through the indirect channel of the interest rate. We reach a medium-term equilibrium with higher prices. In the long term, as the real wage became lower than the new negotiated real wage in the long term, W increases and YS pivots to the left. The increase in W and the upward wage price spiral will bring us to a new long-term equilibrium with higher prices and lower output compared to the medium term and compared to the initial situation. Be careful here. We assumed in this podcast that the shock on nominal wages was only a supply shock. In the next video, we will explore how these conclusions change when an increase in nominal wages is analyzed as both a supply and a demand shock.